Today I'm making Green Ramona Flowers Blaster. I mean Hera Syndulla. That's the one. It's not Scott Pilgrim. Space Scott Pilgrim. For this build, I used EVA foam, craft foam, putty, paint, super glue, hot glue, cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. First, I dug out one of my old clone blasters to use as a scale reference because it has similar dimensions. I landed on this basic shape and traced it 3 times in order to get the correct depth. Then I cut them out of a sheet of EVA foam, floor mat foam. These were 3/8 inches thick. Although, I noticed that like the ones that they mark 3/8 and 1/2, they're always a little bit less than that, like by a couple millimeters. And I'm sort of wondering, what's the deal with that? Or are they including the depth of the uneven pattern on one side? These are the thoughts that don't keep me up at night. That's how I count sheep. And oh no, my audience is asleep. Focus. Narration. I made sure to cut one in reverse so that the pattern side would be hidden on the inside. I also made sure the center one had a trigger. I used to make these complicated trigger mechanisms and build them into my foam blasters, but with foam that isn't really necessary because it's kind of plush. Like after painting, if you paint it right, you can squeeze that trigger and it's not going to break off. Of course, I think at the time I was sealing my foam with PVA glue, which dries solid and totally negates the plush aspects of foam. See, as more and more my props get exposed to more and more actors, all I'm trying to do is just make these things damage resistant. Action. That hammer actually held up. Although, I was so concerned with the prop that I put a backpack on the ground to just sort of cushion the blow. There was a box of chalk in there that just got obliterated. I just coated the whole inside of it with white powder, which really glad I didn't run into any authority figures before I had time to clean it, So then I glued the sections together. Unlike my armor builds, there's not gonna be any stress on these seams really, so I can get away with hot glue here. I hot glued that in place. I weighted it down with metal machinist blocks, which will not only help it hold in place, but as the glue dries, the blocks, being metal, will help to disperse the heat. When the first 2 layers were secure, I glued the third one on as well. I would have done it all at once, but I just turned on that glue gun and it takes a minute to heat up. Now I've got a basic blocky blaster. That's good for the body, but the handle has to be rounded, so I carved it up a bit with my work knife. This isn't very precise. To really get it smooth, I'm gonna need to use a sanding tool, but this is just me trying to cut down on the dust, because all the material that I can remove now is not gonna go onto my floor. I smoothed that out to make it uniformly rounded, and after a very boring clip that did not make the cut, we have a slightly less basic blaster. For the cylindrical parts, in the front and back, I used scrap pieces of foam dowels left over from lightsaber builds, stunt lightsaber builds. I cut them down to size and glued them into the large open space back there. Now the diameter of these barrels varies, and the connecting parts are tapered cones because the designers hate me and know that I'm gonna have to sand all these pieces. So I sanded them down from foam circles and more dowel sections. Just super boring footage that you don't need to see. Then I added in some of the more blocky angular details around them. I used super glue for these pieces because they're so small that the hot glue might actually warp them, not to mention the glue would likely smoosh out from underneath and then I'd have to clean that up. I stacked several layers on top to get the correct height of the top barrel. Hera's blaster has 2 barrels to make it extra blasty. I'm definitely seeing some Blade Runner influence in this blaster. Like, is that ever addressed? Why does the Blade Runner blaster have 2 barrels? Anyone? Finally, I glued a foam half dowel on top and cut it down to size. I covered up all the seams from the stacked foam with a piece of 2mm foam on either side. Then I made this detail on the back out of scrap foam bevels of varying diameters. Cylindrical bevels, half circles, half dowels. I used more scrap to make some of the details on the inset portion of the blaster, and then added another dowel section to the front in order to make the lower barrel. It needed to be cut a bit more intricately in order to fit the weird geometry of the blaster's body, which honestly is overkill if you're just making a Halloween costume or convention piece, but I tend to get tunnel vision when it comes to prop detail. Sorry about my voice in this one, guys. I was literally on a farm the other day, and I'm apparently allergic to everything. Then I made the top barrel muzzle out of stacked foam circles. Actually, I made both of them out of stacked foam circles. These were just offcut sections from foam dowels from earlier builds, although some were drilled from scrap foam using a leather hole punch. The narrow muzzle on the end of the bottom barrel is a capacitor, by the way, for no other reason than I stepped on it, I got stuck into my foot, and I'm like, I don't want this to ever happen again. I could just sort my spare electronics. Never! Spend too much time sorting as it is. This far, no farther. I glued a bevel on either side, made from 4mm foam, then a raised portion on the grip from 2mm foam this time, as well as a little service panel on the side there. Only on that side though. And then bands on the back cylinders. And I added an offcut from a foam sphere to the base of the grip on either side. This is why I save the offcuts. They're just interesting shapes that would take a long time for me to sand if I had to make them from scratch, you know? I think these were off of the Ahsoka saber, and the other one was from the Pit Droid. I also added a wide half-cylinder foam bevel on the lower front portion, and fins on either side at the top. Some of these details are mirrored, but not all of them. The details on the other side are a bit different. There's a toggle switch in the inset part there, and to be honest, I made up the rest of the details. I just had a lot of scrap pieces and don't like blank spaces. Those dots, those are the center punch outs of Benny's foam chainmail. I swear I use that more for the dots than for the actual chainmail. Sorry, Ben. I just had a lot of scrap pieces and I don't like blank spaces. And so it goes. Okay, Kurt Vonnegut, where was I? Now that all the solid details are done, I can prep it for paint. I use filler putty. It's a DAP product. Alex Fast Dry Putty to fill in the cracks on the handle, which is the only place you can still see the layered foam that I started out with. This dries pretty quickly, but I still propped it up next to a box fan because I'm a busy guy. To prep for paint, I give it a very quick blast to the heat gun. This seals up the surface of the EVA foam, making it less absorbent when I paint. Then, I painted it with 3 layers of gloss black acrylic house paint until it was shiny on all sides. I had to do this in stages to avoid drips from forming in the final paint job, which sounds tedious, I know, but the alternative is using Plastidip, which is 1,000 times more expensive. Well, probably like 80. In terms of coverage, you get more coverage from acrylic house paint than from a can of Plastidip. It'll stretch your dollar further. Not to mention, it takes as long for the fumes to air out as it does to just paint it with gloss black acrylic. Just saying. It's not that I don't occasionally use it, just not usually. When it was dry, I masked off the parts that would need to stay black, and then I gave it a coat of silver paint. Once that was dry, I painted it blaze orange. So there were a lot of great props in Star Wars Rebels, and I was always a little bit bummed out that I missed the opportunity to build those at the time while the show was still on the air, for one reason or another. Although, I mean, I did burn a lot of time building an entire droid, so that, I don't know, you gotta weigh these options. Do I build all the lightsabers or one droid? These are the questions that keep me up at night. But now I can build a lot faster, and the Ahsoka show stars many of the main characters who have all the same stuff, but now in real life, as opposed to animation, so it's like a whole new opportunity. Once that was dry, I peeled away the masking tape to reveal the black underneath. I went back in with more black to touch up the paint job where the silver snuck in underneath. Occasionally it happens. I also had some flat black in the crevices to look like dirt and grease buildup. Well, soot buildup. If you want it to look like grease, then you'd use more gloss. Then back in front of the box fan. When it was again dry, I went over all of the edges lightly with silver rubbing buff, which is meant to imply that it's old, it's worn, it's been used. Anywhere where it could have been banged up against an edge, the paint's been chipped away. I also alternated and used some bronze rubbing buff for some of the interior details. And that's it. That's how I made Hera Syndulla's blaster. Thanks for watching, everybody, and let me know if you want to see me make the rest of the costume. Because as everyone who watched the Atomic Heart build knows, I do know at least one green actor. I'd know more, but the government doesn't like people walking around with a demon core. Who knew? Although we would need a few more patrons to make that happen, because Hera's costume is kinda crazy. And I know this looks like a lot of patrons, and don't get me wrong, I can't thank them enough. There wouldn't be any videos without them. But when you're talking about involving actors and wardrobe for the actors, the budgetary requirements just immediately skyrocket. And yet it's not even like the head tentacle things. It's the clothing costs more than the props. It sounds crazy, but that's literally how it is. It's like, I gotta make a World War I pilot costume mixed with a prison jumpsuit for an alien. Yeah, it's kind of a tall order. I was just on a movie, and wardrobe was just, it was nuts. They dressed us up from a really specific time in history that are just not easy to come by. And they went all out on these costumes. But then they handed me a musket, and I'm going, the flash pan's missing. This thing is not gonna work at all. I can't win a war with this. And they're like, it's fine, we'll put you in the back. And I'm like, okay, should have kept my mouth shut. My point is, the clothing is more expensive than the props. Who knew? But if you want to see that, then there's a Patreon link down below. Thanks again, happy crafting, see you later.